Hello, and welcome to Passing the Mic, a series of conversations that will explore the issues that matter most to school leaders, teachers, students, and parents. I'm Sachelle Harris. Providence, Rhode Island Superintendent Harrison Peters was 1 month into his superintendency when COVID-19 forced his schools to close. In today's conversation with Client Teams partner Christina Brown, Superintendent Peters will share with us how he is responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and another pandemic that is impacting his students, a pandemic we call systemic racism. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Christina and Harrison, take it away.
All right. So how you doing today, Harrison? I wanted to have a conversation, talk about how you've been responding to the COVID-19 crisis and planning for reopening. I think you're in an unusual situation as superintendent in that you were 1 month into your superintendency when everything closed down. So can you talk about the challenges that you faced since you started in Providence?
Yeah, no question. So thanks for having me. Really exciting times, to say the least. We stepped into the superintendency in Providence at the end of February, and the beginning of March, obviously, we got the call and say, guess what? We're going to distance learning. So no one would have been able to script this. And I always frequently say, Christina, there's no playbook for this. But we've had a history in Providence of not serving students well. Recently, about a year ago, Johns Hopkins came out with a very scathing report and really characterized us as one of the lowest performing school districts in the country. So as you can imagine, that sent shockwaves across the entire city of Providence. And this is not the first time we've received a scathing report. We've got something similar, almost 10, 15, 20 years ago. But there is something differently about this report and sort of the momentum that it garnered. The commissioner and the governor got together and decided to take over the school system, and through some very sort of aggressive actions took control of the school system. And I was fortunate enough to be named superintendent to lead this turnaround effort. We just walked into a situation where, quite frankly, 83% of the students aren't on grade level in ELA, and 83% of the students aren't on grade level in math. And that's just unheard of, and it's grossly inappropriate. And it just speaks to the educational negligence that we've had. And Dr. King talked many years ago about the American country writing a check that it hadn't cashed. And we've just written a check educationally that we've not been able to cash in Providence. But we're also excited that we are in a new direction. So walked into just some really tough issues where teachers felt demoralized and unappreciated. Chronic absenteeism was extremely high. Our infrastructure was crumbling and aging. I mean, safe, warm, and dry was almost non-existent. So about $1 billion worth of deferred maintenance. And as a result of the state intervention, we have to walk into a collective bargaining conversation. So renegotiating the contract with the union. And then we got, to top that off, we've got a worldwide pandemic that we've had to deal with. So definitely some challenging times. And again, there's no playbook for this, but we're definitely excited enough for this opportunity.
Excellent. Can you talk about the focus for students, and as the public health crisis unfolded, how have you and your team been working to support students as schools close? And when you think back over the last few months of remote learning, what are some challenges and what are some bright spots for the district?
Yeah, so got that call Friday afternoon about 1:30 and said, hey, we've got to transition to distance learning in a very short period of time. We're going to go on spring break for a week, and when we come back, we've got to be ready. So I think the first thing you have to think about is we were lucky. We were a 1-to-1 district already. So we had enough devices to deploy. But the unfortunate reality is all homes aren't created equal. So we had to step down a couple steps on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And as students had laptops, we had to also assess if they had internet connectivity. We've also had to ensure that our families were being fed. The other piece is a whole entire shift in our workforce. Teachers weren't ready to pivot to a new way of teaching and a new platform. We had to have over 900 professional development sessions for teachers to take advantage of just to get ready to teach in this space that was very foreign to us. And you think about how significant the digital divide, what COVID has done, it has really sort of exposed the naked underbelly of a lot of the inequities that we've had. And those inequities were just extremely exacerbated because we continue to disenfranchise the students that were in families that were already disenfranchised. So really working overtime. I think two things that we're excited about is when we started to respond and sort of get our sea legs under us, we did a couple things. We immediately transitioned 200 of our bus monitors to a call center. And all we want you to do is take 10 to 12 to 15 families per day, and we want you to call. And we want you to ask, how are you doing? How's it with connecting with schools? Are you connected to the internet? Are you eating? So those very basic things that we want to make sure that we were trying to support our families around. And then a robust outreach. So having a call center where we were outreaching, and this is an engagement strategy, ensuring that teachers and schools are outreaching to every student. Initially, we had a couple hundred students that we had no contact with, but through outreach with our truancy officers and our social workers and psychologists and all of our sort of frontline personnel, we were able to get it down to less than 50 students that we've not had any contact with at all. And we believe that those students may have returned to their country because of the pandemic.
That's helpful. Can you talk about the 900 PD sessions? Can you talk about where you focus trying to build teacher capacity to address what it means to have a spring break shift from in-person learning to remote learning, and where you put sort of the most energy in developing that capacity?
Yeah, so we went through several stages with teachers. Quite frankly, let me be very clear, Herculean job by teachers. I mean, they were just, many were very frightened because many of our teachers are digital immigrants. They've not grown up in this space. So just the technology seemed to be a bit tough for them. But as we help them understand, like, we are a Google district, we got tons of professional development that can help. Step one, how do you get on and create a class? Step two, how do you interface and how you engage? B, how we're gonna take attendance. C, how do we look at what does high quality learning look like? And I think the other piece were the expectations. Christina, from day one, it was my expectation that we had school online. I want to be very clear. We were in the middle of a crisis, and I'm not insinuating one bit that we hit a home run. But we had an expectation that we were going to have learning and we we're going to have new material. Because one of our firm beliefs here in Providence is there's no such thing as a COVID pass. 2 or 3 years from now, or even more, when our scholars are out in the field and out in the community and out in this world, they're not going to be able to raise their hand and say, hey, I went to school during a time where there was COVID. World doesn't care anything about that. So how do you ensure and understand that families, students, and teachers are, quite frankly, going through a crisis right now, but also understand that we have to have high expectations, because we learn from research piece after research piece that those expectations are critical. So as we're trying to support families around Maslow's hierarchy needs, we wanted to make sure that the other side of the coin was full of very high expectations. And that was a huge Herculean lift for teachers to transition from the traditional brick and mortar to now, how do I engage in this online space? How do I keep kids engaged? How do I get them logged on after lunch? How do I create lessons that's enticing and appealing? But also, how do we diversify? Because we don't want our children in front of a device for 7 hours a day.
Thank you. As you look ahead to the next school year, and as you've been planning for reopening in the fall, whatever that looks like, what's been most important to you, and how have you been thinking about balancing the very real academic gaps that students will be returning with, and the importance of helping them cope with the trauma that they may have experienced, and the difficulty of readjusting to so many school after so many months away? How are you thinking about putting those pieces together for students and for teachers?
Very interesting learning that we've had through this process. What we've been able to unearth are a couple things. A, through this whole COVID crisis and shifting to the distance learning platform, we have disenfranchised a community of students that just don't like it. They didn't respond to it. It's not fitting their learning styles. They miss their teachers. They miss that personal interaction. But we've also tapped into and liberated another community of learners that love it. It's their space. It's their sweet spot. So we coined this phrase, we don't have to, why go back? The old way wasn't working for everyone, so we're not interested in going back to the old way. So the opportunity is now is how do we continue to reinvent learning? What I want the community to understand is we fully acknowledge that we are still amidst trauma. This is a crisis. We're losing students, we're losing community members, we're losing faculty and staff. So we know that there has to be some very intentional healing when we come back. So we've contracted with one of our strong partners to help us really design some focused social emotional learning lessons that's integrated into the first 5 days of school. No question, pre-K all the way to 12, we're gonna heal and we're gonna talk about it. Now, quite frankly, we know that 5 days isn't nearly enough. This is a philosophy and an expectation that we're gonna have throughout the year. But again, this crisis has allowed us to innovate. We just don't have to do things the way that we did. So we're really excited about that. And then the other piece is how do we ensure that families feel safe and teachers feel safe? Because quite frankly, our polling suggests that many families, nearly half of our families, still aren't quite comfortable coming back. And we've got teachers and leaders that have pre-existing conditions and they're reticent to come back to it. So our primary concern is to make sure that we are being health conscious, we're being safety. This is a health crisis. So we are looking at some very different sort of entry points based on DOJ guidance. But the reality is we know that this has been a traumatic situation for many of our students, many of our families, and also many of our educators.
So I want to come back to talk about the crisis, but also talk about the crisis and the reckoning with systemic racism and how you think that is impacting students as they experience their time away from school. I know Providence had the largest march that it's ever had in the history of Providence, and many students were at the forefront of leading that work and their activism. How do you think about how you address that in the return to school for both students and staff and for the community?
We want to celebrate our students. No question, student-led activism, student-led protests that were nonviolent, that were peaceful, that was focused on the issues that they believe are important, that we all believe are important, were absolutely necessary. So we celebrate that. And as a Black male leader, the crisis that we're in hits home. And we've talked about this COVID-19 crisis, this virus. Racism is also a virus. And we need to respond just as diligent with all the vigor that we are with COVID-19, with finding an antidote and a vaccine for racism as well. So as a school district, we're gonna be very clear, first of all, that those behaviors and actions have no place in Providence public schools. We're just gonna call it out. Secondly, we're gonna have a very aggressive campaign in making sure that we mandate anti-racism, culturally responsive and sustaining training for our teachers. We're gonna work really, really hard to diversify our workforce. Right now, our students of color make up about 90% of our student demographics. Yet we have about 85% teachers that are white. Not saying that white teachers can't deliver high quality instruction, but we know the value in students being able to walk the halls of the schools, that they spend almost 7 or 8 hours in per day and see role models and people that look like them. And not only in the school halls, but also in the curriculum and the textbooks that we choose to put in front of our students. So not only just having the physical space, but what are students engaged in? Do I hear Black and Latino heroes in our books that we are celebrating, that we're learning about? Or are we celebrating the rich histories of all cultures? So we're gonna have some very specific steps. And I would say the final piece that I'm also equally excited about is we've hired a chief diversity and equity officer who is charged with ensuring that she is unearthing every part of the school district, making sure that we're leading with equity and diversity. She's working with every department and every division to make sure that there are equity goals that we are going to be held accountable for. And also our Commissioner of Education, Angelica Infante-Green, has stepped out and committed a very bold plan for the state. So in order to actualize her vision, we've got to make sure that we are doing our part locally. So commend her beyond measure for having that vision and that push statewide, but more locally here in Providence, we're going to have a very aggressive approach to these things.
Can you make the connection between some of the things you just talked about in terms of how the district wants to address systemic racism and the turnaround action plan that was just released in partnership with the state? and Ride last week, and how you see those two goals really aligning.
Yeah. So I think that there's keen alignment between those two. I talked a little bit about the challenges that the school district faced when we were walking, and we're still faced with. When we look at the turnaround action plan, it's built on, quite frankly, four core values: students first, equity and access, transparency and results. And these are things that, as the commissioner brought together 45 very diverse people from the community to write the plan through the lens of the community design team, were the things that they called out. Because at the end of the day, there were three top tier sort of guiding principles or core values that we look at: sort of engaged communities. Communities felt as if they did not have a voice in what was happening in schools. So in a very deep way, they were co-creators in developing this turnaround plan. So it has an enormous footprint of the folks in the community. Excellence in learning. We talked about just where we were academically as a school district. We stepped out and purchased K-8 curriculum in language arts and in math that's going to systematize and revolutionize the work that's happening. So a very consistent curriculum across the district, that can help meet the needs of teachers with staff development, but also in a district that has high mobility rate. How do you ensure as students go from school to school that they aren't falling behind? You said something earlier about this, the loss that has happened in COVID-19. I think that we cannot be naive to the loss, but I think we have to flip the coin and say, how do we ensure that we're meeting students where they are and taking them where they need to be? So this notion of acceleration versus remediation has really taken hold in our district. World-class talent. I talked about the demographics of students versus teachers in the district. We've got to make sure we're having the best professionals in front of our most vulnerable students. And then not necessarily part of the core value, but I think an organizational fundamental thing that needed to shift is how we do work in central office. We were just not built centrally to support and transform schools. So we've tried to redesign, reorganize, streamline, and make central office smaller, therefore pushing resources, decision-making, all of those things closer to the folks that actually do the work. So we've rolled out a really aggressive turnaround plan that has some very audacious goals, just because that's what our students deserve. And we know it's an iterative process. We know that we've got to do some mid-game adjustments, but we know that we've also got to have extremely high expectations for the city of Providence.
Some of the things that you talked about really resonated with some of the work that TNTP has done around the opportunity myth. And I know that that research that has struck a chord in your work. So if you could just talk about how you see that as something that is a message, that some of the messages in there about community engagement and the importance of reaching out to families and making sure that students' goals are well known and that they're given access to the 4 resources, how you see that in some of the work that you have coming up.
Yeah, no question. It just makes good educational sense. And I'll tell you just quickly, I used to work in Chicago public schools, and not too long ago, we closed 51 schools at one time. And just about all of them were in poor communities of color. And if you know anything about the symbolism that schools represent in those communities, you could imagine the traumatic experience that was for community. But the lesson that we learned from that is you just can't close schools down and send students to other schools and expect them to just integrate, expect them to just go along and get along. We believe students are very resilient, and adults as well. So this is why we were very intentional around developing these social emotional learning plans, because we want to ensure that students are being reintegrated in a very respectful way. I say that because as you look at the opportunity myth, it undergirds that philosophy that interaction between teacher and student is the most valuable experience possible. And all the research talks about that teacher having high expectations has the largest effect size on student achievement. Parallel what you just said, Christina, we believe that all students deserve on-grade level instruction. And as we dig into the opportunity myth, it is very clear that disproportionately students of color do not receive grade level instruction. Many of it because of this learned helplessness and this belief that because we're 3 or 4 years behind that we can't give them grade level instruction. Well, the opportunity myth dispels that myth because students in the opportunity myth overwhelmingly had high expectations for themselves. So quite frankly, the students are waiting on the adults to get ourselves together.
I want to connect that to the lesson plan project that TNT worked with Providence on for return to school. You could say how having K-12 lesson plans for the first 5 days is supporting an academic vision for Providence, and how you see that rollout contributing to the work of teachers and work that teachers and students do together.
No question, we believe this is going to be a game changer. And not only do we believe this is something that teachers and parents and communities have been asking for. If you look at the John Hopkins report, if you look at the Ernst Young report, if you listen to the community design team members, if you listen to the community conversations and focus we're having about reopening, everything speaks about how are we going to address this trauma? How are we going to address the crisis? So the lesson plans that we have developed and TNTP has led, it's going to be absolute game changers because we know that you cannot get to Bloom's until you get to Maslow's. And this is a way for us to work through Maslow's so that we can get students to Bloom's. There is absolutely no question that these are going to be extremely powerful game changers. Teachers have been asking for them, principals have been asking for it, and in our preliminary conversation, there is sheer excitement. Our challenge is how do we take it well beyond the first 5 days of school? So we're ready to dig into that and begin to operationalize and really develop teachers in our schools around it this summer.
Can you talk about the bridge of the 5 days to the high quality instructional material curriculum adoptions that Providence is undertaking?
No question. One of the requirements for this project is that it fits healthily with our ARC training, our American Reading Company, and our Eureka math rollout. No question, teachers get frustrated when they feel as if there's one more thing on their plate, Christina. You know, you've been there. We want to make sure that we get something that's powerful enough that teachers say, hey, this is good stuff, but also that it's not added work. And I think part of what we've been met with is the optimism that teachers said, hey, you know what? This is good stuff. This is what we've been asking for. Now they see the healthy integration into your daily lesson, that it now becomes happenstance, it becomes habit as we begin to build out more lessons and more opportunities in PLCs and in our planning and our staff development. It just becomes part of the tapestry and the drinking water of the district because teachers see how it can easily be incorporated in their daily lessons. So we're excited about that. And that was one of the universals, one of the expectations that we had when we took this project on.
Excellent. One of the things I'm thinking about is I'm sure you're not the only, Providence is not the only district that is in turnaround status and is also experiencing COVID. So what are the things that you would, from where you sit, think about important to share with other districts that are trying to engage in transformation during this period of time in our history? Yeah,
so you can't run away from the brutal facts. You absolutely have to galvanize the community and face the absolute brutal facts. There's no question that we were in educational crisis, but we're not going to live there. So that hope and that optimism that exists is also going to be sort of the engine that propels us forward. We have been able to galvanize the community in a way that I don't think that it has been galvanized. Everyone in this city believes that education has to change. So we are keenly aligned on the what. I think now we have to continue to polish the how. So if I were to offer any suggestions to folks that are in turnaround, hey, listen to your community. Listen to your community. They absolutely know what they want in their schools. And then as you listen to your community, how do you juxtapose that with the best practices and the thinking that's out there? And then the second piece that I would add is do not feel that you have to know it all. There are partners out there like TNTP that will help make sense of the crazy, weird science stuff that superintendents have in their head. So rely on your thought partners, rely on those people across the country that have done this work, that live in this space, and this is what they do in their area of expertise. And then I think the other piece is expectations. You absolutely have to expect that every child is going to be successful. We have an enormous opportunity here with our multi-language learners. We've got an extremely diverse school district. We have a lot of students that are differently able. a lot of students that have come to us, newcomers, first time from other countries with no formal expectation. No formal education. We have the same expectation for those students as if it were one of my sons who grew up in my house. So have very consistent and high expectations for every student. And then the final piece is be willing to pivot. There's no playbook for this book, for this process. So you have to be able to look at the data that's in front of you and pivot. So as you continue to keep your voice and your ear to the needs of the community, as you continue to mine the data and build out sort of strategies that are aligned to what needs to happen in the classroom, because that's our theory of action. Our theory of action is the teachers make the magic happen, and there is no substitute for great teaching. And you couple that with high quality, effective leadership and a supportive central office that understands how it is supposed to morph to the daily needs of school, you can definitely develop a recipe for success.
I want to follow up on that and ask about leadership and how you're thinking about how you support principals in this time. We talked a lot about teachers, but how do you think the role of principals is different, and how are you setting up for the opening of school year with your principals?
Yeah, we are getting ready for a pretty significant, robust Principal Institute where we're going to roll out some significant expectations. I've never apologized about the value of teachers. No question. Teachers saved my life. But we believe that our building principals are the weathermen and the weatherwomen of the work. They set the conditions for teachers to make the magic happen. So it stands to reason that we're getting the most high quality, agile, fearless, cage busting leaders that country. So no question, that's the message that we're sending. But we also know that there has to be a huge, robust set of supports, pressure and support, accountability and support for principals to need to lead the work. You don't hire principals and just leave them out there by themselves. So that has also necessitated us to scour the country and get the best principal supervisors that can go in and help build capacity, work side by side with job embedded support for principals, as principals are working side by side with job embedded support for teachers. We truly believe in that 70-20-10 rule. 70% of your learning and professional development is actually on the job in the moment. 20% is maybe staff development, and maybe 10% or less are these conferences and these other sort of wholesale learnings that you have. But the way that you change practice, and we believe in habits of mind. What are those effective habits that we want to see in schools? How do we codify? How do we build on them? And how do we give one another feedback? So you'll see an intense focus on building site-based leadership, teacher leadership, but also interim leadership that supports the principal through the role of the principal supervisor.
And I'm curious, earlier you said that some students struggled with remote learning, and some students were like, this is how I want to do school from now on. Can you say more about how you're thinking about enabling that choice for students, and how you're also thinking about how teachers make decisions about just how to support based on where you end up in September, whether it's remote or virtual?
No question. So quite frankly, we've had students that love this distance learning. And I would say from several perspectives. If I can take you inside the classroom of a group of students that a teacher is zooming in on, teachers have begun to see firsthand some of the realities of our students, and they've experienced and seen poverty like they never had. So in essence, you've got students who are literally on a Zoom call trying to learn, and there are sick parents in the background. Or there's a student who's at the secondary level who has become the primary breadwinner because mom and dad are either laid off or they're sick. So not just providing a distance learning space, but also the flexibility of when you hop on and learn as well. So again, we have the opportunity to lead learning, to re-envision Providence Public School education for Providence Public Schools in a very different manner. We've been listening to students. We've run focus groups of students, teachers, parents, what's working, what's not working, what should we continue to do, and what. So students were very clear. This all day Harrison from 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock, it's not working for me. You know, I work, or my parents work. So they have informed, I believe, is gonna be some very innovative decisions. So right now we're looking at what does it mean to have a schools without walls, where we are actually developing learning around the needs of schools. So students, so if you work during the day, is there an opportunity to get to deep, rich learning in the afternoon. Or if you miss a math class, why should that be the end of your education during the day? Why can't we necessarily innovate? And even with teachers, one of the things that I share with them is we've got to be uber flexible, because you may have teacher at school A who teaches algebra, but she may teach 40 or 50 students across the entire city. So let's just throw the contract out of the way. Let's throw collective bargaining and laws and policies. Let's start with the blank slate. And let's talk about what students need. Let's put them in the middle of that easel. And let's start to design or redesign an educational world that has them in mind and them at the center, and everything leads to them being just high performing and giving them great outcomes.
What are the most, it's really fascinating to hear you talk about, like, let's put students at the center and just redesign and reimagine. What are the things that have given you most hope of this time about re-envisioning and reimagining?
Several things. I've got to give a hats off to teachers. We've gone through stages of grief. There was sheer fright among teachers transitioning to this distance learning. It went from, oh my God, I have no idea, I don't like it, I want my babies back, I miss them, and they still do, to saying, you know, I've had some training, I had some professional development, it's not bad. So moving forward, if we had to go back, I'd like a little more professional development. I like the opportunity to converse with my counterparts around some of the problems of practice they're experiencing. Love an opportunity to be able to plan, because planning in a virtual environment is very different, Christina. So we've learned some very cogent lessons, and the commissioners come out with a very bold statewide calendar next year. So every school district in the state will seemingly be on the same calendar, professional development days, distance learning days built in. So she has already started to think innovative around how we educate children. But no question, just having teachers think differently was one of the things that it's difficult, because we didn't learn that way. We weren't taught that way. We didn't go to our colleges of education that way. So for us to shift was very difficult. But then I think just the sheer nature of the times, there's a reticence for some families to say, hey, I just don't feel comfortable sending my students back. My student has a pre-existing condition. I don't want to put my students on a bus. So by that sheer nature, we are forced to provide various options. But it's a good thing, because we've also had to step out this traditional age-old lumbering bureaucratic educational box and just think really with the needs of students in mind. And I think that was the biggest shift for us, and the biggest shift that's occurring in Providence is shifting from an adult-centered construct to completely student-centered, where we're designing learning based on their needs.
That's really helpful. What role have students played in this shift to a student-centered approach? And how have you connected with them during this time to think about this reimagining?
Yeah, so I've got a group of students that are on my COVID task force. They're telling us what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what they want, what they don't want, how teachers can be more effective and how leaders can be more effective. How can central office and community agencies support education better? What they want to see out of their education. So those have been very helpful things. The other piece is this whole challenge of grading. I think the entire nation we struggled the last couple of months. Do we give grades? What does it look like? Should we give a pass or fail? Should we give A, B, C? So our student unions and our student leaders came out really loud and really proud around the inequities around grading. They were at the table, and by and large, they informed our grading policy. So we went to a pass-fail grading policy, and it was largely because of the push, the feedback that they had given. And again, it's no panacea. No decision you land on is perfect, but it was student-centered. It made sense. And our sort of mantra was do no harm. And they were really powerful and really apt and strategic around laying out the inequities. A student should not be punished for something that's beyond their control. And they led with that, and we heard them. And that push was very powerful in us designing a grading system that we thought was the most equitable for all students.
One of the things we'll do when we put out this Pass the Mic podcast is to also share some of the lesson plans, a few samples of those. And I'm just wondering, as you think about resources that have been shared in the field for COVID-19, what have been the resources that have been most helpful, and what resources would you like to see in the field going forward that can address the challenges that school districts are facing right now across the country?
No question. So I'll start with the lesson planning with the embedded SEL components that TNTP has helped us develop. Absolute game changer, no question. I know that McKinsey has put out some thinking from across the world, how school districts across the world in Korea and other places are responding, because they are probably about 6 weeks ahead of us. So what's happening? What are the trends? What are the patterns? I know Teach for Change has led a national sort of project management infrastructure to help school districts think about how are they reopening. So if you need a project management framework, they have provided a strong sort of roadmap around reopening. Just centers to talk, so we've also worked with Brown University for their Center for Slavery and Justice to talk about, okay, how do we ensure that we're leading through the lens of equity and anti-racism? Because quite frankly, the murder of George Floyd has just turned the world upside down. So we can't deny the power that this sort of movement has caused. We've got people, quite frankly, all around the world that are standing shoulder with people of color and say, we understand, we agree with your stance, we support, and we're gonna fight with you. So I think that it's important that, again, as I said earlier, you do not go at this alone. If you do, it's going to be a very difficult journey. And we're so lucky that we've been able to have some partners that have been with us sort of stand hand and foot the whole journey. And we're going to continue that relationship because we don't have all the answers, but we do have partners that can help us think through that.
And I think I want to come back as we get ready to close to think about the impact of the murder of George Floyd and all of the protests. And I know I've been thinking a lot about students who have engaged in independent and activist learning during their time away that has given them a different way of grounding the reason to learn, the reason to read, the reason to write and speak and engage in math in sort of new ways. And I'm wondering about how do you create an environment that's ready for the students that have been out leading protests and marches and have been willing to really engage as leaders and willing to make their demands known when they get back to classrooms that sometimes might feel like there's an adultist approach. And so how do you prepare for people who've been leading for a few months to come back and engage in a space where they're not allowed to lead in the same ways, or may not be allowed to lead in the same ways, because maybe they are, we can reimagine a world in which their leadership is seen differently.
Well, when we create the school system that we believe is serving students, they will be doing that. We expect to celebrate that. And I want to be very clear. I wrote an open letter to the community. Many people call it a murder, Christina. I call it a lynching. And I'm very careful with the words that I use, because when you talk to Black folks, there is some symbolism around the word lynching. When you look at a Black man that's on the ground with his hands basically tied behind his back, and then there's a knee on his neck that's reminiscent of a noose from back in the days where we lynched slaves. We look at that as a lynching. And I think that symbolism, on top of just the absolute disregard for life, is what has spurred this huge international uproar. So as students come back, we want to celebrate the fact that they've been so active. And I've committed that the superintendent that students of color, teachers of color will no longer have to live in the shadows. It's okay to be unapologetically Black. It's okay to be unapologetically Latino. It's okay to live the life that you believe best suits you, whatever your community believes. It's okay. We're not going to have this monolithic society where we allow these crazy things to keep the voices away from our students. I want to be very careful, because at the end of the day, this work is about children. And if we're not leading with and through the eyes of children, then we're not doing the work. So they will have a stage, they will have a voice, they will have adults that put the needs of students first, They will have a superintendent that will not ask them to deny nor apologize for being who they are and believing what they believe. We want to be able to scholarly debate and talk about it and create a stage for discourse, but we're not going to deny that. And we want their voice, we need their voice. We're a better school system when we're listening to their voices.
I think a better school system when we listen to the voices of the students is a great place to end. Thank you for this time. Really appreciate the thought partnership and the work, and really looking forward to continue to work with Providence Public Schools.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Passing the Mic. We encourage you to keep the conversation going and share your thoughts with us on social media using the hashtag #PassingTheMic_TNTP. We look forward to connecting with you during our next conversation. Until then, stay safe.